Marcus had just stepped off the train, ready to finally return home after months of deployment. But the moment he entered the station, everything shifted. A white cop, his eyes filled with prejudice, stopped Marcus without cause, in front of curious onlookers. Marcus was ordered to open his bag and questioned like a suspect. The weight of humiliation pressed down on his shoulders, a soldier who had spent his youth protecting his country. But just 7 minutes later, that same cop was suddenly suspended on the spot. What happened next shocked everyone present and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more like this. The airport was a strange kind of sanctuary. A place where anonymity should have thrived. Yet, for Michael, anonymity was often an elusive guest. One that fled as soon as he stepped into rooms like this. The first-class lounge whispered with the sounds of privilege, soft clicks of expensive luggage wheels. Delicate rustles of newspapers being folded and refolded by hands that had long forgotten how to labor. Here, the air seemed lighter, as if it had been sifted for impurities before being allowed to circulate. Michael chose a seat in the farthest corner, away from the bar, where patrons laughed softly over glasses of scotch that looked older than some of the flight attendants. He wasn't trying to hide, he simply preferred the quiet. His tailored navy suit felt like armor, though he wished it didn't have to. As he opened his tablet, the day's news filled the screen. Mergers, international summits, market dips. He skimmed through with the detached efficiency of a man used to scanning for things that might matter. Across the lounge, Jessica noticed him. She didn't mean to. In fact, she wasn't even fully aware of the attention she had given him at first. Her eyes lingered for only a beat longer than they had on anyone else. But sometimes, a beat is enough to plant a seed. Jessica had worked this route for years. She knew the regulars, the executives who tipped generously at the end of each flight, the celebrities who slouched low behind designer sunglasses. Michael was not a regular. And something about him, maybe it was the simplicity of his watch, or the absence of any recognizable flash of status, unsettled her. He doesn't quite fit the first-class crowd. Does he? Jessica whispered to her colleague, who busied herself arranging napkins. Her colleague barely glanced up. He's got a first-class ticket. That's all that fits. Jessica smiled thinly but said nothing more. The seed had been planted, and its roots were already tugging at her thoughts. Michael, unaware of the storm he had unintentionally stirred, continued to scroll. His shoulders relaxed, but not too much. He had long mastered the art of occupying space without causing alarm. When the boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, Michael stood, moving with the ease of someone who belonged but was never quite believed. He passed Jessica at the gate. His boarding pass extended in one calm, unhurried motion. The agent greeted him warmly. "Good to see you again, Mr. Bennett." Jessica's brow furrowed. By the time Michael reached his seat 2A, a window, Jessica's thoughts had crystallized into something sharper. Perhaps she had seen mistakes before. Passengers sliding into first-class seats that weren't theirs. Maybe she was simply protecting the integrity of the cabin. Or maybe she was protecting something else. She approached his row, her footsteps soft but deliberate. "Excuse me, sir," she said, polite but distant. "I think you might be in the wrong seat." Michael's eyes met hers, calm and knowing. There was something disarming about how he didn't flinch, didn't rush to explain himself. Without a word, he handed her the boarding pass. Jessica's gaze dropped to the slip of paper. 2A, first class. Her eyes flicked back to him, searching for something else, some discrepancy that might justify the disquiet she felt. "Thank you," she said, her voice cooler now. Michael smiled faintly and returned to his tablet. But Jessica lingered. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But something about him felt out of place. Her feet carried her toward the galley, but her mind stayed rooted at 2A. The cabin lights glowed soft and golden, casting halos over passengers settling into their seats. Michael leaned back against the plush first-class headrest, watching through the small window as airport staff bustled below, their neon vests blinking like distant signals in the night. He felt the shift in atmosphere before she arrived. The weight of unspoken questions often preceded the words. Jessica appeared at the edge of his vision, her smile polite, practiced, but there was something behind it, a hesitation stitched too tightly into the curve of her lips. Sir, she began, her voice low and even. I'm going to need to see that boarding pass one more time. Michael's gaze drifted from the window to her. Slow and measured, he searched her face, though he already understood. He reached into his jacket pocket, unfolding the crisp slip of paper, and handed it over without speaking. Jessica examined it, perhaps hoping the text would shift under her scrutiny. The seat number, 2A, glared back at her in unflinching ink. She nodded, lips pressing together as if to smother the discomfort swelling inside her. Thank you. And still, she didn't move. Michael had encountered this before, the lingering, as though proximity might unravel some secret about him. One that explained how he had come to occupy a space not meant for him. Jessica's eyes flicked toward the galley. She didn't want to cause a scene. Is there something else? Michael asked, his tone calm, almost gentle, as if he were addressing a child lost in an unfamiliar place. Jessica blinked, caught off guard by the question. No, she said, too quickly. No, everything's fine. Michael nodded once, and she turned away, retreating toward the back of the cabin where the other flight attendants prepared for departure. But he could still feel her watching. In the galley, Jessica's hands tightened around the edge of the service cart. Her colleague from earlier glanced over, sensing the tension. What is it? Jessica exhaled slowly, shaking her head. I don't know, she muttered. Something feels off. Her colleague raised an eyebrow. The man in 2A? Jessica didn't answer, but the silence spoke for her. You checked his pass. Twice. I know, Jessica admitted, voice clipped. Her colleague shrugged, then let it go. But Jessica couldn't. The feeling sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and unshakable. She replayed the moment in her mind, searching for a missing piece that might justify her unease. Maybe it was the way he looked too at ease, too composed, as though the world couldn't touch him. But wasn't that the point of first class? Jessica's thoughts twisted in on themselves, circling questions she couldn't answer. She glanced down the aisle, toward the seat that seemed too big, too grand for the man occupying it. The wheels left the ground, and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Jessica moved carefully between rows, offering glasses of wine and warm towels to passengers who barely looked up from their screens. When she reached 2A, Michael glanced at her but said nothing. He accepted the glass she offered with a quiet, "Thank you," his voice carrying the weight of patience. It wasn't defiance that lingered around him. It was something quieter, sharper, the kind of calm that could only come from enduring this moment 1,000 times before. Jessica felt it, as she returned to the galley. Her steps slowed. She wasn't wrong, was she? Michael rested his hands on the smooth leather of his briefcase, his thumb brushing over the worn handle. He could hear the faint murmurs behind him, passengers exchanging hushed speculation. Though their words rarely rose above the engine's hum, he had learned long ago not to flinch. When the world expected you to apologize for occupying space, stillness became its own quiet resistance. But still, the whispers pressed in. She asked him to move back. Didn't she? A woman's voice floated from the row behind. She should have, came the clipped reply. First class isn't for just anyone. Michael's hand tightened around the briefcase. His father's voice echoed in his mind, the memory worn smooth from overuse. People will find ways to make you small, his father had said once, over dinner in their cramped Harlem apartment. But son, don't you dare hand them the knife. Michael smiled faintly. In the galley, Jessica's supervisor, an older woman with silver streaks threading through her hair, approached quietly. You've been circling that man all flight, the supervisor said, arms crossing over her chest. Why? Jessica hesitated. I don't know, she admitted finally, shoulders slumping slightly. Something feels out of place. Her supervisor's gaze softened. And what exactly feels out of place about Mr. Bennett? Jessica blinked. You know him? The supervisor's eyes narrowed, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. Oh yes, she said. Mr. Bennett doesn't just fly with us. He owns part of this airline. Jessica's heart sank. Her supervisor leaned in slightly. You've been watching him like you're waiting for him to slip up. But let me tell you something. Jessica, you'll be waiting a long time. Jessica's face flushed. The supervisor's voice softened. You're not the first to make this mistake. But don't let it sit too long, or you'll carry it with you longer than you need to. Jessica swallowed hard, the weight of her own assumptions curling inside her chest. Michael felt the shift the moment Jessica returned. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. She paused beside his seat, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Bennett," she began softly. Michael set aside his tablet, meeting her gaze with quiet expectation. "I want to apologize," Jessica said, voice just above a whisper. "I misjudged you." Michael let the silence stretch between them. Then he smiled, not out of forgiveness, but something deeper. "You're not the first," he said quietly. Jessica nodded. "I know." And for the first time, she truly did. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, steady as the quiet tension that lingered in the cabin. Michael remained in his seat, his briefcase untouched, hands folded loosely in his lap. Outwardly, he seemed the picture of calm, a man unbothered by the world around him. But he had long learned that quiet was not the absence of sound. It was the weight of it pressing down, filling spaces no one else dared to claim. Jessica felt it too. She moved mechanically through the cabin, offering drinks and small comforts. But her thoughts clung to 2A, the man she had asked to move. Twice. The man who now sat still as the hum of the engines. A reminder of something she wasn't ready to name. Passengers in first class shifted beneath silk blankets, but their eyes found him occasionally, lingering longer than necessary. He felt them. Michael always felt them, and Jessica saw it. A middle-aged man seated in 3B leaned toward his seatmate. His voice hushed but clear enough to carry. "I'm sure he's someone important," the man whispered, "but you have to admit, he doesn't look like first class. Does he?" Jessica's hand tightened around the drink tray. The seatmate, a woman dressed in quiet pearls and tailored comfort, glanced over at Michael and shrugged. "You know how it is," she murmured. "They always say times are changing. But some things." She let the sentence trail off, her meaning intact without needing the words. Jessica's heart thudded against her ribs. Before, she might have nodded along silently, perhaps even felt validated in her earlier suspicion. But now, those words felt like a reflection she didn't want to see. It wasn't Michael who seemed out of place. It was them. It was her. In the galley, Jessica poured coffee into porcelain cups, but the steady stream seemed louder than usual. Her supervisor lingered nearby, arranging dinner trays with deliberate care. "You're quiet," the older woman remarked without looking up. Jessica's hand trembled slightly as she placed a cup down. "I heard what they said," she admitted softly. The supervisor paused, the edges of her mouth pulling into a tight line. "Of course you did," she replied. "You always hear it. That's the thing about silence. It's loudest when it comes dressed as politeness." Jessica glanced down the aisle, her eyes settling on Michael once more. "He heard it too," Jessica said, the realization settling uneasily in her chest. Her supervisor nodded. "He's heard it his whole life." Jessica turned back to the coffee pot, the rising steam curling around her fingers. "I should apologize again," she said, almost to herself. Her supervisor's gaze softened. "No," she replied gently. "You already did. This isn't about him forgiving you. It's about whether you can forgive yourself." Jessica swallowed, feeling the words tighten around her throat. But forgiveness felt far away, like a seat she hadn't yet earned. Later, as Jessica made her way down the aisle to distribute meals, she noticed a new tension forming a few rows behind Michael. A young black man no older than 20 sat in 5D. Earbuds tucked in and eyes closed. He wore a hoodie, pulled up just slightly over his head, and a pair of worn sneakers that peeked from beneath the seat. Jessica saw at the moment the older gentleman in 4C stiffened. The man's posture shifted, shoulders drawing in as though the presence of the younger man behind him warranted physical alarm. Jessica's stomach tightened. It was subtle, a glance over the shoulder, a faint narrowing of the eyes. But it was there. She had seen it before. Moments later, the man pressed his call button. Jessica approached, careful to smooth the tension from her face. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely. The man's gaze flicked toward the row behind him. "I was wondering," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Do you think that young man is supposed to be up here?" Jessica's breath caught. She straightened slightly, her hand gripping the notepad at her side. "Yes," she said firmly. "He's exactly where he needs to be." The older man blinked, surprised by the edge in her tone. "I was just asking," he muttered, sinking back into his seat. Jessica said nothing more. As she walked past Michael's row, she caught his eye. He hadn't missed the exchange. His lips curled faintly at the corners. Not in amusement but in recognition. It was a look that said, "I've seen this too." And suddenly, Jessica felt at the enormity of that knowing. It stretched beyond the cabin, beyond the quiet of this plane. It was woven into the fabric of every boardroom Michael had ever sat in. Every sidewalk he had crossed. Every table where his seat had been questioned. It wasn't just her mistake. It was 1,000 small cuts, dressed up as caution. Hours passed, and the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight stretch of the flight. Jessica moved softly through the aisles, her hands grazing the tops of seats as she checked on passengers. When she reached Michael's row, she paused. He was awake, the faint glow of his tablet illuminating the calm lines of his face. Jessica hesitated, searching for the right words. But Michael spoke first. "You don't have to say it," he said without looking up. Jessica exhaled softly. "I know," she replied, "but I'm going to anyway." Michael set the tablet down, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't just misjudge you," Jessica continued, voice barely above a whisper. "I let everyone else's judgment speak louder than what I knew was right." Michael regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's the hardest thing to unlearn," he said quietly, "but you're working on it. That's what matters." Jessica smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. For the first time, she realized this wasn't a lesson that ended when the plane landed. It was something she would carry long after the seat belts clicked open. The cabin lights dimmed, but darkness rarely meant rest. For Michael, night flights were never about sleep. The sky beyond the window stretched endlessly. Yet the cabin itself felt smaller with each passing hour. Jessica made her way down the aisle. Her heels hushed against the carpet. She stopped occasionally, refilling half-empty glasses or offering pillows to restless passengers. But when she passed Michael's seat, she hesitated for a breath too long. He noticed. Michael glanced up from his tablet, his eyes catching the flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Is there something else, Jessica?" he asked, voice low but pointed. She stiffened slightly at the sound of her name. He hadn't said it often, but when he did, it was deliberate. It carried weight, like he was reminding her that names, like seats, weren't meant to be questioned. Jessica swallowed. "No, sir," she replied, her voice softer than intended. "Just making sure everyone's comfortable." Michael's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, but he said nothing. As she turned, retreating toward the galley, she felt his gaze follow her. The first-class cabin was quiet now, save for the occasional flick of a page or the muffled shuffle of blankets. Jessica stood in the galley, hands folded neatly before her. The silver-haired supervisor leaned beside her, sipping lukewarm tea from a small cup. "You're still watching him," the older woman observed without looking up. Jessica exhaled slowly. "It's not about him," she replied, though she knew the words felt hollow. Her supervisor chuckled under her breath. "It's always about him," she said. "That's the point, isn't it?" Jessica frowned. "I don't understand." The supervisor set the cup down, folding her arms across her chest. "Michael Bennett doesn't just sit in 2A. Men like him sit in every room we walk into," she said quietly. "And we always notice, even when we don't want to." Jessica's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. "You think this is about one mistake?" The supervisor continued. "It's not. It's about what you do with the next one." Jessica nodded stiffly, though her thoughts swirled with doubt. The next one. It was coming. She could feel it. 2 hours later, the hum of the engines was the only companion to the silence in the cabin. Most passengers slept, faces softened by the lull of altitude. Jessica moved quietly, straightening headrests and tucking loose blankets around curled bodies. When she reached the row behind Michael, she paused. The young black man in 5D was awake, earbuds hanging loosely around his neck. He was staring at the small screen embedded in the seat before him, though it didn't appear to be playing anything. Jessica cleared her throat gently. "Can I get you anything?" He glanced at her, his eyes weary but kind. "I'm good," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty his words suggested. Jessica lingered. "Rough flight?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Something like that." Jessica nodded, smoothing her hands over her apron. "You know," the young man added after a pause, "I saw how that man up there looked at me earlier." Jessica froze. He shrugged lightly. "It's not new, but I thought maybe tonight I could just sit here in peace." "Guess not." Jessica's throat tightened. I'm sorry, she said quietly, as if the apology might erase the weight of it all. The young man looked at her, his gaze steady. It's not on you, he replied, but it is always on someone. His words lingered long after she left his row. Later, as Jessica refilled water glasses in the galley, the man from 4C appeared, his steps slow and deliberate. Excuse me, he said, offering a tight-lipped smile. Jessica glanced up. Yes, sir? He shifted awkwardly. I noticed that young man hasn't moved much. He began, his words careful but dripping with implication. Jessica stiffened. Is there something you need from him? The man shook his head. No, he said quickly. Just wondering if he's all right. Jessica let the silence stretch between them. Sir, she said evenly, he's as all right as any of us at 35,000 feet. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, though he didn't press further. As he returned to his seat, Jessica felt Michael's eyes catch hers from a few rows away. He had seen the exchange. She wondered if he was disappointed. The flight neared its descent, and the first faint glimmers of dawn brushed the sky beyond the windows. Jessica made one final pass through the cabin, checking seat belts and trays. When she approached Michael, he set his tablet aside and regarded her carefully. Jessica, he said quietly. She straightened, hands folding before her. Yes, sir? Michael's eyes softened. You can't carry the weight of everyone else's ignorance, he said, but you can decide not to hand it forward. Jessica felt the lump rise in her throat. I know, she whispered. Michael smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I believe you, he replied, as the wheels touched down and the cabin buzzed to life. Jessica realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't about the man in 5D. It wasn't about Michael Bennett. It was about all the quiet moments in between, the space between apologies, where choices were made without fanfare or witnesses. And sometimes, that was where the real fight began. The wheels met the runway with a shuddering grace, and the cabin lights flickered brighter, calling passengers back to the waking world. Jessica stood by the galley, hands clasped as though holding something fragile. The flight was over, but not yet finished. Michael remained seated as the plane taxied, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the window, beyond the pale horizon splitting night from day. He looked comfortable, yet entirely aware that comfort was often conditional. Jessica envied his stillness. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching limbs and rolling stiff shoulders. The man from 4C rose first, his steps slow as if waiting for someone to acknowledge his presence. When no one did, he turned toward the exit, his briefcase swinging lightly by his side. He paused just long enough to glance at the young black man in 5D. It wasn't a long stare. In fact, it was brief, clipped, almost polite, but Jessica saw the shape of it. It was the same glance someone gives a stranger on the wrong street at the wrong hour. The kind that asked a silent question no one dared voice aloud. What are you doing here? The young man looked back, his expression neutral, but Jessica knew neutrality was a mask worn only by those who had no other choice. As passengers filtered out, Jessica moved closer to the front of the plane. Michael remained seated, seemingly in no rush to leave. She stopped near his row, hesitating for a moment. Mr. Bennett, she began softly, unsure if she should continue. He glanced at her with that same unreadable calm, tilting his head slightly in acknowledgement. I wanted to thank you, Jessica said, her words measured but unsteady. For your patience, and for earlier. She faltered, searching for the right thing to say. Michael smiled faintly, folding his hands over his briefcase. You don't need to explain, he replied. Not to me. Jessica's shoulders relaxed, though her stomach tightened with something she couldn't name. But, Michael continued, his voice dipping lower, you might need to explain it to yourself. Jessica blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in the way a teacher might regard a student struggling with the simplest of lessons. You carry it with you, he said plainly. I've seen it before. The apology you think you owe me is not for the seat, Jessica. It's for the questions you never asked yourself about how you got here. Jessica felt the air shift, as if the cabin itself had shrunk around them. She swallowed, glancing away for a brief second. I'm not sure I understand, she whispered. Michael's smile didn't waver. You will, he replied softly. Later, As Jessica assisted the last passenger, a woman juggling too many bags, Michael passed quietly through the jet bridge. He didn't look back. The young man from 5D followed shortly after, his hood up and headphones slipping over his ears. Jessica's eyes tracked him until he disappeared into the terminal. Her supervisor appeared at her side, the older woman watching the emptying plane with the detachment of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Flight went smoothly, the supervisor remarked. Jessica nodded absently. Any issues? Jessica hesitated. She thought of the man from 4C. The glances, the tension that lingered long after it had faded from sight. No, she said quietly. Nothing that wasn't already there. Her supervisor didn't press. Instead, she offered a knowing smile and patted Jessica's arm gently. Welcome to the rest of your life, she said, walking away toward the terminal doors. Jessica remained behind, the silence of the empty cabin wrapping around her like a heavy coat. She thought of Michael's words, their weight impossible to ignore. It wasn't the apology. It was the why behind it. And that, Jessica realized, was far more difficult to explain. The terminal was wide awake, humming with the restless shuffle of bodies that always seemed in motion yet never truly moving forward. Jessica stood just past the gate, watching Michael disappear into the crowd. His steps were unhurried, as though he carried time differently than the rest. She envied that too. Behind her, the plane loomed large, empty now but still echoing with the weight of small moments. The kind that didn't make the flight log but stayed with you long after landing. Jessica lingered longer than necessary, pretending to rearrange boarding passes at the gate counter. She told herself she was simply unwinding after the long shift. But she knew better. It wasn't the flight that lingered. It was the glance, the one from the man in 4C. The flicker of suspicion he wore so easily. Like an old jacket that fit just right. Jessica saw it everywhere now. She saw it in the subtle way the gate agent's eyes narrowed as the young black man from 5D approached the exit. She saw it in the security guard's slow head tilt as he watched him pass, tracking him just a beat too long. It was quiet, but deafening. By the time Jessica returned to the crew lounge, the other flight attendants were already peeling off their uniforms, slipping back into the anonymity of jeans and jackets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unflattering. Jessica sat near the lockers, unpinning her hair with fingers that moved slower than usual. Her colleague, Maggie, dropped down beside her, sighing as she kicked off her heels. You're quiet tonight, Maggie said, tugging at the zipper of her bag. Jessica shrugged. Just tired. Maggie glanced at her, unconvinced. That's not tired, she replied. That's something else. Jessica hesitated. She thought of Michael's words, the way they sank into her skin like ink she couldn't wash off. You ever feel like you're part of something without realizing it? Jessica asked softly, not quite meeting Maggie's eyes. Maggie paused, her expression shifting slightly. What do you mean? Jessica exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. Like maybe we're part of a system that keeps people in their place. She said, even when we don't mean to. Maggie's brow furrowed. Jess, if this is about the guy in 2A, it's not just him. Jessica interrupted. Her voice was sharper than she intended. But she didn't pull it back. It's all of it, she continued, her tone softening. The way we watch some people more closely. The way we ask certain passengers for their passes twice, even when we don't have a reason. The way someone can sit quietly, minding their own business, and still feel like they have to prove they belong. Maggie leaned back in her chair, chewing her bottom lip thoughtfully. I guess I've seen it, Maggie admitted, though her voice carried the hesitation of someone unsure if they should say more. But it's not our fault. We're just doing our jobs. Jessica met Maggie's gaze, searching for something in her friend's face that wasn't there. I thought that too, Jessica replied, but I don't think that's good enough anymore. Maggie's eyes softened. Yeah, she said quietly, maybe not. Later, as Jessica slipped on her coat and made her way through the terminal, she spotted the young man from 5D standing near the baggage claim. His earbuds were in, and he scrolled through his phone casually. But there was a tension in the way he stood, like he was waiting for something that might not come. Jessica slowed her steps. A few feet away, the man from 4C was collecting his luggage, his eyes flicking toward the young man once more. Jessica clenched her jaw. She didn't know why she approached. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was anger, or maybe it was the fact that for too long, She had let moments like this slip by, telling herself they were small, insignificant, but small things had a way of growing. She stepped beside the young man, standing just close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. He glanced at her, surprised. Jessica smiled, though it was brief. "I liked having you on the flight," she said quietly. The young man pulled out one earbud, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Jessica nodded toward him. "I just wanted to say I'm glad you were with us tonight." The young man looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind her words. But then, slowly, he smiled. "Thanks," he said simply. And that was enough. Jessica watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the crowd. The man from 4C glanced at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. But Jessica didn't acknowledge him. She let the silence settle between them, heavy and deliberate. As she turned toward the exit, Michael's words echoed softly in her mind. "You can't carry the weight of everyone else's ignorance." No, but she could refuse to make it lighter. The airport at night was a different world, a quieter, softer version of itself, where footsteps echoed a little longer and the spaces between people felt wider. Jessica walked slowly toward the staff exit, her mind trailing behind her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She passed by large glass windows overlooking the tarmac, where distant lights blinked steadily against the dark. The same planes that brought people together also divided them, she thought. First class from coach, aisles from windows. The spaces weren't always physical, but they were there, just the same. Michael's words still clung to her. "You might need to explain it to yourself." Jessica wasn't sure how to begin. In the days following the flight, Jessica couldn't stop noticing it, the quiet, invisible sorting that happened everywhere she looked. At the gate, the black family boarding early drew subtle glances, the kind wrapped in unspoken questions. At security, the older white man with the frayed jacket walked through without a second glance, while a Middle Eastern couple stood to the side, their bags unpacked by hands that moved too slowly, as if searching for something to justify the search itself. Jessica watched these moments pile up like loose change in her pocket. Small, but noticeable when you counted them. It had always been this way. She just hadn't wanted to see it. On her next flight, Jessica felt the weight of the cabin differently. Every row felt like a ledger. Each interaction a quiet entry in an ongoing calculation. Who was seen? Who was overlooked? Who was asked to explain themselves? When she passed through first class to collect drink orders, she noticed the man in 3A, middle-aged, white, crisp button down. He barely looked at her as he handed over his empty glass, muttering, "Whiskey." Neat. In 4C sat a black woman, maybe in her late 50s. With soft eyes and a green silk scarf draped loosely around her neck. She smiled as Jessica approached, the warmth genuine but tempered, like someone who had learned to brace for a colder reception. Jessica smiled back. "Would you like something to drink?" The woman hesitated. "I'm fine with water," she said softly. Jessica paused. "You sure? We've got wine, champagne, whatever you like." The woman's smile widened slightly, her eyes searching Jessica's face for a trace of irony that wasn't there. "Champagne, then," the woman replied, a quiet playfulness in her voice. Jessica poured the glass carefully, handing it over with both hands. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't much, but it felt like something. Later, in the galley, Jessica's colleague Maggie nudged her with a playful grin. "What's going on with you?" Maggie teased. "You're hovering over these passengers like they might float away." Jessica laughed lightly but didn't answer right away. She thought of the woman in 4C. The flicker of surprise in her eyes when offered something without reservation. "I guess I'm just trying to pay attention," Jessica replied, smoothing the edge of her apron. Maggie arched an eyebrow. "To what?" Jessica shrugged, not sure how to explain it without unraveling the quiet shame she had been carrying since the flight with Michael. "To the things we pretend not to see," she said finally. Maggie's expression softened. She didn't ask any more questions. Near the end of the flight, Jessica passed by 4C again. The woman had fallen asleep, her head tilted gently to the side, scarf tucked closer to her chin. But as Jessica adjusted a nearby tray table, the man in 3A leaned toward her, his voice low but cutting. "You sure that woman belongs up here?" he asked, tilting his head toward 4C. Jessica's hand froze over the tray. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice firm. "She does." The man chuckled under his breath, leaning back in his seat. "Just asking," he said, as if his curiosity was harmless. Jessica stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Would you have asked the same about you?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Jessica didn't wait for an answer. Back in the galley, Jessica leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. Her supervisor passed by, eyeing her carefully. "Everything all right?" Jessica hesitated. Someone in 3A had a question. She replied. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Jessica's lips tightened. "About whether his seatmate belonged there." The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "And?" Jessica straightened her posture, feeling the steadiness return to her chest. "I told him she did." The supervisor didn't say anything right away, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the small nod she gave before walking away. Jessica remained in the galley, her heart still beating faster than usual. She knew it wouldn't be the last time someone asked. But next time, she wouldn't hesitate. The plane descended slowly, dipping beneath the clouds as the city lights blinked into view. Jessica watched the sky soften through the small galley window, her reflection faint against the glass. She wondered if Michael Bennett was somewhere down there now, moving quietly through a world that often paused to question him, pausing, but never truly stopping. Jessica envied his calm, but not the price of it. In 4C, the woman with the green scarf stirred, stretching as the soft chime of the landing announcement hummed overhead. Jessica returned to the cabin, the gentle chaos of disembarking passengers beginning to build like a current tugging everyone forward. She moved carefully down the aisle, offering polite smiles and folded blankets. When she reached 3A, the man who had questioned 4C's presence sat rigidly, thumbing through his phone with a kind of practiced indifference. Jessica hesitated. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice steady but pointed. The man glanced up, offering a brief nod, his attention already elsewhere. But Jessica lingered just long enough for him to notice. He met her eyes, and for a fleeting second, something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not anger, just recognition. It wasn't much, but Jessica knew that even recognition could be a kind of weight. The passengers trickled out, one row at a time. Jessica remained by the exit, watching each face as they passed, some smiling, some indifferent, others wrapped tightly in their own small worlds. When the woman from 4C approached, she paused, adjusting the scarf gently around her shoulders. "Thank you," the woman said softly, "for the champagne." Jessica smiled, feeling the warmth of it in her chest. "I hope you enjoyed it," she replied. The woman leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. "I noticed what you said to him," she added, glancing briefly toward 3A. Jessica's breath caught, but she kept her smile intact. "Sometimes," the woman continued, her tone calm but certain, "it's not about making a scene. It's about letting people know you see them." Jessica nodded. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think so too." The woman held her gaze for a moment longer before stepping into the jet bridge, disappearing into the current of travelers moving forward. As the last passenger left, Jessica began the slow process of clearing the cabin, folding seatbelts, lifting stray napkins, smoothing the wrinkles from the world others had left behind. Maggie appeared by her side, dragging the cart down the aisle. "You were sharp tonight," Maggie remarked casually. Jessica arched an eyebrow. "Sharp?" Maggie smirked. "I saw you with 3A. He's probably still thinking about that." Jessica exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "I wasn't trying to prove a point." Maggie stopped, resting her elbow against the seatback. "I know," she replied. "That's why it worked." Jessica didn't answer, but a faint smile tugged at her lips. In the empty terminal, Jessica walked toward the staff exit, the weight of the flight settling into her limbs. The night air hit her as she stepped outside, cool and quiet beneath the glow of the streetlights. She thought of Michael again, wondering if he'd walked through these same doors, wondering if the distance between them still stretched quietly in the spaces they hadn't spoken aloud. Jessica didn't know if she would see him again, but she knew the questions he left behind weren't going anywhere. And perhaps that was the point. The world didn't shift in grand gestures. It shifted in the small, steady ways people chose to stand when it was easier to sit, when it was easier to stay silent. Jessica adjusted her bag over her shoulder and stepped forward into the night. She couldn't change the sky, but she could make sure the air beneath it felt different. One flight at a time.